how do I say it? I say it differently every time, but I'm someone who's lived through a variety of mental health, illness, addiction challenges, and come out the other side a healthier, happier, and more resilient human being. And I'll get into a little bit about that. But so I started this thing called Starts With Me. Through my own journey, I mostly through suffering, but I got to the point of, wow, if I'm not willing to take the steps necessary to change my life, then nothing's going to change, right? I think Carla sort of alluded to that, how that works for herself. And before this came about, I spent a lot of time in, I guess, high school education around mental health. I started with CAMH, and I'm still part of one of their high school education programs called Beyond the Cuckoo's Nest, which is super cool. I don't know if anybody's watched One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, but that in a larger societal context was the first time that people got an inside look into what psychiatric institutions looked like. And it's sort of, God, I don't know when the movie came out exactly, but the program at CAMH has been around for 30 years this year. And so it's taken a long time for that to sort of percolate throughout the system, I guess, society. And so over the years, I started working with more hospitals and mental health agencies and school boards. And this spring, summer is the first time that I've really been working in the corporate world a lot more. So I've got a lot of dates over the next couple months doing similar things to this, and it's really exciting for me. It's sort of the next step of my journey. And the one thing, if I were to narrow down what it is I'm trying to do, I'm trying to create platforms to increase individuals' and families' capacity for well-being. That's pretty much as simple as I can say it. So to me, what's nice about what I'm doing is that it doesn't matter where I'm doing it. I may change around the messages a little bit here and there, or the examples, but it's the same message everywhere I go. We all have something inside of us that is universal. And when we speak to that, we can communicate better with each other, and we can help each other better, and we can be more supportive. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what mental health is, what mental illness is. We'll go through some warning signs of personal and somebody else. So if you're worried about something that's happening, how can you identify it better? How can you identify it in others? Talking about that. So I think we got a great example of what that could look like. So maybe I'll skip through that a little. And then understanding sort of beyond the mental health jargon, what are some things that we can do to build resiliency or manage the spirals, because they do happen to all of us. And then if we have time for Q&A, we can do that as well. So mental health is physical health. So part of this whole mental health awareness movement is, you see it often, mental health is as important as physical health. To take it one step further, the brain is an organ, it's inside our body, which means it's part of our physical health. So there is no actual difference. And the more we come to that maybe understanding, the easier it might be for people to say, something's wrong with my brain and I want to get some help. The same way if you break your arm or you have a heart problem or a liver problem, whatever it is, you would just go and ask for help from your doctor. Or it's so much more common to maybe, I don't want to say complain about a physical ailment, but we do that often, right? Oh, my back hurts, or oh, my whatever, I gotta go. There's a video I wanted to show. There's a really funny clip where the guy says, oh, my ankle, I need to go see my physical therapist. And the guy beside him goes, you go to therapy? Whatever, weirdo. And he kind of walks off. But that's how it is when we sort of, or that's sort of been maybe the historical context of when we talk about seeing a psychotherapist, right? Or something when it comes to mental health. And I'm amazed at this scene right here, because this is such an example of where I think this movement is leading us. And this is just, it's beautiful. What do we got next? So to get a little clinical here, which I don't often do, but this is important. This is a model that CAMH uses, so the Center for Addiction Mental Health. It's the biggest mental health hospital in Canada. And it's called the dual continuum model. And what it shows is that, the middle axes, which I'm not a math person, but what's this one? Is it X? X is across? Okay, so on the Y-axis, thank you. And God knows how many times I've asked that question. You can see it's sort of mental health is on a spectrum or a continuum. So we all have mental health, we all have a brain, and depending on what's happening in our lives, we can be really well mentally, emotionally, spiritually, or we can be low. And sort of we all go up and down between that. And when those things get to maybe a point where a diagnosis is maybe appropriate, then you cross over the line to mental illness, right? Which is a diagnosis from a psychiatrist or a psychologist. So psychiatrists are the only ones who can prescribe medication, or a family doctor. Psychologists can diagnose you, but they can't prescribe medication. And I guess another way to make it clear is you can have poor mental health and no mental illness. You can have really good mental health and also a mental illness. Just depends on how you're caring for yourself. So my brother lives with schizophrenia, and so sometimes when he's not well, he might be on the severe mental illness side and also really minimal mental health. But luckily, through family support and etc., today he lives quite a good quality of life. So he has a mental illness and he also has pretty good mental health. So he sort of can go up and down on both of those axes, if that makes sense. I'm somebody with a host of diagnoses too, if you will. So the same thing for me, but I guess what might make me a little bit different than most people in terms of me being here today and doing this is that I guess my suffering was so acute that I took it upon myself to do anything I possibly could to change that. And literally, one of the most important people in my lives told me in the very beginning of this, if you put anything in front of taking care of yourself, you're going to lose it. And that stuck with me really deep. And so I made taking care of myself the most important thing beyond anything. So beyond my wife, into recovery, I had 2 kids. So if I'm not taking care of myself, then I'm a useless dad, I'm a useless husband, I'm a useless human being in the world. So I could easily slide down both of those axes if I'm not taking care of myself. And the way that my life used to be is enough to motivate me not to let that happen. And it does happen sometimes, right? We all have bad days. My symptoms, so to speak, may get in the way of my day here and there, but it doesn't get in the way of my life anymore, which is pretty amazing. So there are maybe 3 main diagnoses, and I don't want to hit on this too much, but it's important to go over, I think. So there's anxiety, depression, and psychotic disorders. I'm not the biggest fan, I guess, of the way these things have been classified up until today. So there's something called the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, that psychiatrists create to help identify people's problems. So it is important, it's useful. But when we get stuck into the diagnoses and the labels, sometimes it prevents people from moving forward, or also even from helping people. So when you say this person has this diagnosis, sometimes there's a pull to get stuck in that place. And then you're not helping the person address other areas of their life possibly that may ameliorate their symptoms. So that's something I'll talk about in a minute. And I call it the gray area of diagnoses, because if you really dig through it all, depending on who you talk to and what kind of day it is, you could get slapped with a different diagnosis, so to speak. So it's helpful, but at the same time, it's got room for improvement. And I think some psychiatrists that I speak on panels with and do stuff like this with acknowledge that there's a problem there. And they are actually working towards trying to change it. And then there's the other half of the profession that's still sort of stuck in the pharmacology, I guess, approach, or the brain analyzation kind of way of looking at things. And then psychotic disorders are sort of things like schizophrenia, where people have hallucinations, basically. So when someone is in psychosis, they're actually not perceiving reality the same way that other people are. So they have hallucinations often, and that's through the senses. So sight, sound, touch, taste, smell. And to them, it's actually 100% real. So when you see somebody walking down the street yelling and screaming at nothing, I mean, I don't know if that happens in Oakville often. I don't know where everyone lives. But if you go to downtown Toronto to certain areas, it's very easy to see somebody experiencing psychosis. And to them, it's so real that there's nothing you can say that would convince them otherwise. So in terms of that, people often need to be medicated so that they can sort of detach a little bit from that experience, and then they gain insight into, wow, I actually am hearing voices and I am hallucinating, and wow, that's really scary. And so that the space between the being stuck in the symptoms and the awareness of the symptoms is really what we're trying to bring to anybody who comes forth with a mental health problem. And once you develop that space, as sort of Carla alluded to, you start to detach from it a little bit, and it's an immense sense of freedom. So when you talked about the bricks, like carrying around a sack of bricks my whole life, and the moment that I said, oh my God, this has to stop, that sack of bricks slowly started to loosen. And that's sort of what happens when we create that space. And the other way, to look at a diagnosis, it's the frequency of your symptoms, the intensity, and the duration. So everyone gets sad, everyone gets paranoid, everyone gets anxious, everyone gets angry. We have a spectrum of emotions and thoughts and et cetera that we all experience. But if those things become seriously problematic in the way you want to live your life on a regular basis, then that's likely a sign that something else might be happening. And when we talk about addiction, so the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, it's still, again, separated. And there's some leading experts in the world of addiction that are bringing maybe a more enlightened perspective. I don't know if anyone knows who Gabor Mate is, but he's someone who I'm quite fond of. And there's many other people like him who are trying to elaborate the conversation about addiction. And I'll paraphrase, but the way that he puts it is, somebody who's in the grips of addiction is trying to soothe an internal pain. So there's pain inside, and to soothe that pain, we need to put things inside of our body to make it go away. And then as a result of that, no matter what the negative consequences of that behavior are, we can't or won't stop. No matter what we try to do, we can't stop. And personally, it's so hard to know because I started getting high when I was 12, and I was basically, you can think about it like a salad bowl. So started getting high around 12. By 13 till 30 years old, I was high on marijuana 24 hours a day. So every morning I'd fill up the salad bowl with marijuana, if you will, and then I'd sprinkle all kinds of other substances on top of that and say, oh, I didn't like that one, or I like this one, or whatnot. And you can throw alcohol in there. And I made a justification to myself that marijuana is the only thing I can do 24 hours a day and not die. I know it's funny because it's true. And that's a great example of the insanity that happens with this kind of stuff, is we come up with all kinds of rationalizations, justifications, and minimizations, if you will, right? Oh, it's not that bad. I'm not going to die. Oh, it's okay. I can still go to school. Oh, it's okay. I can still go to work. Meanwhile, you know, sort of sinking into a pit of despair. And it's so hard to stop without help. And so that's another way to define it from people who may drink often or may smoke marijuana often. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not here to say that there's anything wrong with that because I don't believe there is. It's at the point when you have no control over it that it becomes a problem, or if it gets in the way of the way you want to live your life. And again, a good example is in university, a lot of people party a lot. University ends and they say something along the lines of, well, I should probably maybe change my lifestyle a wee little bit as I enter the working world if I want my life to be successful. Somebody like, and then they stop, or they don't party as intensely. Somebody who's, experiencing addiction or alcoholism, whatever you want to call it, there's no, I'm going to stop because I want a different life. That's not an option. And so we need a lot of help when we're stuck in that place. And how does that work as a family member or someone who's supporting this person? That's really tricky. I'll try to touch on some of those things, but I could talk about that for a really long time. And what seems to be another part of this growing movement of acceptance and awareness and change is the difference between sort of the newer approach is a recovery-based model, and the older approach is more medical. As I was saying before, this sort of split in psychiatry or the way that mental health or illness is treated these days, it's swayed a lot towards the recovery model, which is great. And the recovery model is basically, we need to treat the whole person, or we need to help this person change whatever it is about themselves and their lives that can bring them health. So it's not always focused necessarily on the diagnosis or the brain disorder or whatever it is, as opposed to, maybe even 20 years ago, like when my brother first got sick, it was about 2002. The first psychiatrist he saw said to my mom that your son is doomed and he's going to be miserable for the rest of his life. That was the message that she got, which is just so not helpful. I mean, you could maybe deliver something like that a little more tactfully, but whatever. And so from that perspective, if somebody has a brain disease like schizophrenia or depression, it's there forever. So we got to medicate it and you got to deal with it. I mean, that's basically that model. And as we well know, that's not all that helpful. And it's really awesome to see this sort of recovery holistic approach being brought to the system. Still got a long way to go. And there's also part of that problem, in fairness, is that the healthcare system and government in general is so tied to research and evidence and et cetera. So all of the money historically has been put into these sort of more medical approaches to bringing evidence to the world. And it's a lot harder to, I mean, they're trying, but to bring evidence to something like mindfulness or something along the lines of a little bit more abstract approaches to healing. There's been a doctor in the US called John Kabat-Zinn who started this thing called mindfulness-based stress reduction. And he sort of, I would say, is the grandfather of Western mindfulness. I mean, one of. He brought it into the medical system and he started creating evidence. And now you can get it covered by OHIP, which is great. So I'm actually starting my 4th round of it. It was supposed to start on Tuesday, but I had to miss the first class. So it's a 10-week program, 9-10 weeks. It's group therapy, basically, through mindfulness, and it is fantastic. So my recovery model would be mindfulness, medication, psychiatry, psychotherapy, peer support groups. So I go to peer, addiction groups or alcoholism groups. And, if you told me to get on the ground and lick the floor and it would reduce my symptoms, I would do it. I'm not even kidding. Like anything I can get my hands on to make myself feel better and not how I used to feel, I will do it. And it's nice to see there's a plethora of ways that you can help yourself. And that's another difference here. We get caught up sometimes in thinking the person has to do it a certain way, when, as Carla also mentioned, crafting your own path or crafting your own options is so empowering to somebody. And when we give them the space to do that, great things happen. So there's this thing called warning signs or things to take note of. Some people like different language. And there are 4 main categories. So we have behaviors, we have thoughts, we have our physical body, and we have our feelings or our emotions. One super duper important thing is these are distinct changes in the individual over time. I'm someone who is relatively at ease, if you will. It might be because I sort of was stoned my whole life. I don't know. But if I all of a sudden was jumping around and bopping around and like this hyper jovial person all the time, my wife might be like, what the hell is wrong with him? That's a distinct change in his demeanor. But for somebody who is jovial most of the time and outgoing and et cetera, and then all of a sudden they stop being that way for an extended period of time, that's a distinct change in the way they are normally behaving. Another one might be somebody is very physically active or something, or they have a hobby that they're really into, and then all of a sudden they stop that hobby. That's a distinct change in their behavior. So if you notice that in yourself or somebody else, that might be maybe you could say, hey, I've noticed you are not doing this. Is something up? That's one way to approach it. We'll get through these and we'll talk a bit about more how to approach that. So thoughts. Depending on what your typical thinking patterns are, which is something you explore in CBT, which is also awesome. What are your normal thinking patterns? And if those are changing distinctly and getting in the way of how you want to live your daily life, then that might be a warning sign that something is not going well. I am someone who, one example would be if my kid gets in trouble in senior kindergarten, off I go. My son's going to be an addict. He's going to have mental health problems. Oh my God, he's doomed. What have I done? I'm such a bad dad. What am I going to, Like I go into this catastrophizing, might be one way to say it, pattern of thinking. And that's not helpful. And so I've learned to sort of allow that to exist and accompany it and say, okay, that's nice. Thanks for saying that. And okay, I'll see you later. But that would be my thinking pattern, that when it gets out of hand, it's not helpful for me. And yeah, catastrophizing is like my big thing. But there's lots of different ways of your thoughts. A lot of people can be critical of the self, right? I'm such a loser. I'm useless. I'm never going to get this job done. What's wrong with me? Why can't I, And so that would be another strain. And again, we all have these problems, right? From time to time. We all have these experiences, but when it becomes really a problem, that's when we want to address it. And so the same thing goes for feelings, right? We all get sad, we all get happy, we all have this range of experience. But when it's a distinct change for you, then that might be a warning sign. And then the physical things might be if somebody is often done up or done down, whatever, if all of a sudden they start showing up and like, whoa, you look different today, and that happens over time, that might be something, an example that, wow, something must be happening in their life that's disrupting their everyday behavior. Does that make sense? This kind of stuff? Yeah? Okay. What do we got next? This is from my mindfulness doctor, who's just an amazing human being. And this really helped me understand this stuff. And I don't have I want to go over it because I do think it's super duper helpful. Part of practicing mindfulness, or maybe a different way of handling life, is, are we reacting or responding? So a good example is somebody cuts you off in traffic and you're like, what the, blah, 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 right? That would be a reaction. And when we're in a car, it's a little more understandable because our physical safety is really actually at threat. So that triggers this mammalian brain, if you will, the amygdala, which is what we first evolved with. And that animal response takes over the prefrontal cortex, and you can't think clearly anymore. And then, you get these thoughts, you get these feelings. So a thought might be, what the hell is that guy's problem? He cut me off. You feel anxious or angry, and your impulse to do something. So that would be the swearing or the whatnot. And then it also could lead to a behavior. And the way that we can get triggered, if you will, is through the senses, right? So you see something, you hear something, somebody, I don't know, maybe a coworker doesn't clean up something on their desk. And over time, you just start, like, what the hell? Why won't they clean up? Da, 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 da. I don't want to bring too many direct examples in here, so we don't start thinking about one person in particular or whatever. We all have these experiences. So how can we, again, create that little bit of space that allows us just to be a little more thoughtful and compassionate and less stressed? So we're triggered, we start a thought pattern, our feelings kick in, and then we behave in ways that may or may not be helpful. So if you see somebody struggling, depending on what kind of day you're having, that whole cycle may be completely different. And that's okay. But becoming aware of it and learning to skillfully approach these situations can make massive differences in your life and the life of other people. And how do we do that? Especially, this is such an amazing example to pull from for all of this. When somebody is having a hard time, how do we approach it? So these are ideals, okay? There's a set of ideals in this world of things that we can work towards that are helpful and best practice, if you will. This morning, I'll take an example out of the workplace. My son was not being kind to his sister, so to speak. And for whatever reason, I wasn't as patient as I normally am. So I didn't validate his experience. So when he's angry and he's not getting what he wants, the best way to approach that is to turn to him and validate his feeling. So you look angry right now. I don't have to, I like this sort of word, co-sign the bullshit, so to speak. So I don't have to say, your behavior is okay, I'm not going to do anything about it. But I just need to validate it. And when you validate it, again, that space opens up. There's not as much defensiveness, and the person is allowed to feel what is happening. A lot of our problems are we chop it off up here, right? Someone's having a hard time. Oh, it's not that bad. Don't worry about it. Oh, there's people in the world that have it way worse than you. It's not that bad. So, and we all do it, right? But so we need to allow people to go into their bodies and feel what they're feeling. So we validate their experience. That looks difficult. You seem angry. And then we shut our mouths. And then it's on them. It gives them the opportunity to say, wow, yes, I am angry. And by accepting their anger or their sadness or their happiness, we free ourselves from this weird wanting things to be different than how they are. That's sort of the acceptance. I don't want my son to be whining and screaming right now because it's annoying. And I don't want to listen to it, like, ugh. But that's what I want, And that might be valid in certain situations, but I need to accept the fact that he's not behaving how I want him to behave. Or my wife is doing something that I don't like, right? I need to just validate that she is experiencing that. I need to accept it, not try to manipulate her into behaving in a different way. And the presence is the other thing that's it's sort of the icing on the cake. If you can be there with somebody and give them your eyes and your attention, there is something so powerful in that exchange of emotion or energy or whatever it is. And our eyes, when you lock eyes with somebody, it's sometimes it's whoa, you can really feel it. And that's, a simple 3-step process. Validate, accept that it's not going to be the way you want it and you can't control it, and give them your attention. And that brings it to the next thing of sometimes we can't do that, and that's okay too. So sometimes I may not want to answer a question that my wife has for me or my son or whatnot. And rather than reacting and saying, leave me alone, stop it, whatever, like screw off, when I'm, living closer to my ideal, I can turn to them again, validate they want to talk to me, accept the fact that they are behaving the way they're behaving, give them my eyes and my attention and say, right now is not a good time. Can we talk about this later? Or, I'm sorry you want to talk to me right now. I can't do it. Can we talk about it later? Or, that's not my problem. Leave me alone. Deal with it. This is such a tricky one that takes some sort of skill and tact with, but it is so powerful when you can sort of incorporate it into your daily life. And another great example would be if somebody comes up to you in a state that might be triggering and you get angry too, the line of whose responsibility that situation is gets blurred really quick. So a good example would be, this is a bit of a metaphor. Someone punches you in the face and then you say, what the hell? And you sort of physically respond and restrain them or whatnot to protect yourself. And then they say, well, you started a fight with me and blah, 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 blah. Well, no, you punched me in the face and I'm reacting to that this way. So it's not actually my fault, it's your fault. So when somebody comes at you with emotional slaps to the face and you react in ways that might escalate the situation, the line gets blurry and that person is no longer sort of stuck with the responsibility of their actions, right? You can pull it out if you can have tactful communication, but it's tricky. So that's how kind of all of this stuff ties together. And it's tricky and it's complicated and etc. And in the one-on-one communication, are we hearing the person or are we actually listening? And that's where the boundary stuff is important too. I can hear you right now, but I'm not listening. So why don't we find another time where I can actually listen and be helpful? And I think, that's pretty much it. We're got a couple minutes left. We talked about this a fair bit, how do you cultivate your own well-being and et cetera, and resilience? And there's lots of different ways that you can do that. And sometimes it's kind of like juggling, you're dropping some balls here, you're whatever, doing well there. And you just got to find out what works best for you. For me, the spiritual side of things, the meditation, the mindfulness, that stuff is incredibly helpful and sort of cultivates my soul, if you will. And then if I'm doing that, then the rest of the stuff takes care of itself. I would like to exercise a little bit more, and eat better. I just love candy and sugar. So to review, we know what the difference of mental health and mental illness. We know a little bit about addiction and how it works in people's lives. We talked about some warning signs. We talked about, sort of how to understand what somebody is going through when they're in distress or they're in a mood that we may not like. We talked about the awareness of recovery models and a couple other things, but that's about it. So this guy, John Kabat-Zinn, is sort of the father of Western medical mindfulness, if you will. He has this phrase, you can't stop the waves, but you can learn to surf. And that's a great motto to live by, right? We all get punched in the face by life, and we can get back up and we can navigate. And some of us are better at it than others. But asking for help is an amazing idea if you are curious about how you might handle something differently. And that's sort of my spiel. I ask for help all the time. I'm starting a master's on Tuesday, or next Tuesday, I guess Monday. And the admission advisor emailed me, say, did you have a chance to register and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, yeah, I think I got it okay. But can you take an hour to walk me through it? And she said, I guess so. But that's just, I'm always searching for that help because I just want to avoid how I used to be and become somebody that I'm not. And by asking for help and searching for those answers, I've slowly become that person. And I get to continue to work at that. So you guys are amazing. I don't know. I want to write a blog about this, or you guys should send a press release to the press. I mean, like, this is so cool. So kudos to you guys. You're in a beautiful place, and good luck and etc. And thank you so much for inviting me here. It's awesome.